Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com. And today we're back to talking about the war in Paris. You know, something that struck me in the recent coverage of the Yellow Vest protests is the way that the global media consistently attempts to misrepresent the movement and paint it as something that it simply is not. And what we're seeing is the same sort of coverage and the same sort of public misrepresentation that we saw with regards to the Tea Party back when they first became influential in light of the financial crisis of 2008. And if you notice, we've got this Mickey Mouse here, this image of Mickey Mouse jumping to the front of the parade, affecting to be the leader. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Paris. That's exactly what we're seeing in France. You know, we've seen the French government attempt to meet with the leaders of the Gilets jaunes, and yet none of them want to, you know, with very few exceptions, none of them want to go and negotiate with Macron and the government because they know better. They know what the result of that is going to be. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing the media and their allies in the French government. Because remember, if you're talking about the French government, if you're talking about the British government, if you're talking about the US deep state, if you're talking about the media, if you're talking about the Never Trumpers, if you're talking about the intellectual dork web, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, all of these guys are globalists. They are all different facets of the ideology that wants to end war by eliminating the nations and by creating a one world global government. This isn't conspiracy theory. You can go to the, Committee on Global Governance or whatever. It's all the same. It's all the same. You know, there's different flavors. Different people have different ideas about how things should be structured. Different people have different ideas about the best way to but the overall objective is the same, and it's not any different than it was when the League of Nations was first founded. It's not any different than when the United Nations was first founded. And so if you look at what Plan B is in Paris, first they tried to convince the Yellow Vests to offer up some leaders. You know, we learned this from Gamergate. We learned this that in Gamergate that you can't have any leaders because leaders are structural weak points that are either discredited and taken down or they are bought off. And when there aren't any leaders that can either be discredited in a way that discredits and demoralizes the movement, and if there aren't any leaders to be bought off, then what they do is they assign the movement new leaders. And in the case of the Tea Party, what you saw was people like Richard Armitage. You saw people like what's her name? She used to call herself Monologues. Dana, whatever her name is. Kind of attractive, black hair. Now she's like an NRA figure and so forth. So what what you see in Paris and in France is that they have decided that they're going to anoint the union leaders the leaders of the Yellow Vest movement. Now, this is ridiculous. I mean, the unions didn't drive this. The unions have never been concerned about these various fuel taxes and all that sort of thing. I mean, the unions basically in France, as in America, completely betrayed their workers that they supposedly represented. I mean, anyone who knows the first thing about economics understands that immigrants are the worst possible thing for the labor class. And yet, in every single Western nation, the unions have been bought off. And so, when you look at what is happening in France, is that they're trying to anoint the union leaders, the leaders of the Yellow Vest movement, and then they will make some concessions to them. And then the union leaders will accept that, and then they will try to attempt to convince everyone that whoever doesn't go along with that is illegitimate, does not represent the Yellow Vest movement, etc., etc. They're bad, they're extremists, etc., etc. And so, what you see happening is not new. It's not just not new in the sense that it was successfully done with the Tea Party. It was actually successfully done in 1968. The way that they negotiated a deal with the union leaders, who then were able to put an end to the rioting then. Now, that was more genuinely left-wing. But now when you look at the Yellow Vests, I don't believe that they're going to fall for this. I don't believe that they're going to accept this because they don't trust Macron. They don't trust his government. And nobody trusts their nominal political leadership anymore. I mean, how many of you in the United States trust the Republican leadership? Probably very few of you. Now, I mean, there's still plenty of you who are naive enough to accept the likes of Ben Shapiro and accept the likes of Jennifer Rubin and accept all these fake conservatives that, ever since William F. Buckley, the conservative movement has essentially been there. When you're looking at any move towards genuine nationalism, any move towards protecting the interests of Americans. And so, when you look at what's happening in France and elsewhere, then then you're going to have to learn to pay attention to these various people who put themselves forward as your leaders. I don't put myself forward as a leader of anything. I'm not an activist. I'm almost the exact opposite of an activist. My interest in this stuff tends to be more in the sense of an observer, a historian, a taxonomist. I like to understand this stuff. But what I don't like is I don't like being lied to. I don't like my intelligence being insulted by people saying good is evil and evil is good, that black is white, that white is black, and so forth. And so, I simply don't have the mentality, the personality, or the ambition to do that sort of thing. And so, but there will be people who will genuinely become nationalist leaders and who will lead their nations against this global cancer. And we know it's going to happen, and we know it's going to be successful. The trend is only beginning. I mean, it's what is your bear name? I don't have a bear name. So anyhow, I'm a big fan of the Bears, much respect and all that. But, the thing that I want you to understand is that I want you all to be able to think for yourself. I want you to stop looking for others to think for you or to tell you what to do and so forth. When I tell you that I think something is right, usually I will give you some evidence for that, some basis for that beyond just, my opinion. And so, but what I want you to make sure that you understand is that anyone who gets put forward as a leader by the other side is almost certainly somebody who is being put forward in order to try to divert you, in order to try to gatekeep you, in order to try to neutralize you. And this is an old pattern. There's some quotes that purport to be by Lenin. I'm pretty sure they're fake quotes. They sound a little bit too. They don't sound very Lenin-esque. But it is true that the best way to defeat your enemy is to be your own enemy. If the opposition is controlled, if the whole thing is scripted, like the Harlem Globetrotters versus the Washington Generals, I think they're called, then you're almost guaranteed to win without even trying. So, I'm really not interested in. I get asked about various people, like I don't know much about Tommy Robinson. I don't know a lot about the world of English politics. I know a bit. I knew enough to correctly anticipate that Brexit was going to pass. But, I'm not the truth police. The way that I got into investigating Jordan Peterson was kind of an accident. Someone asked me to take a look at something, and it just happened to be something that I had cause previously to do research on because I'd written a book about it. And so, and then as I mentioned both in the book and I've mentioned before, the way that I got attacked by Peterson fans made me go, okay, wait a minute. There's something more there. There's something else there. And so when you look at the history of events, I tend to follow Tolstoy in terms of my thinking on it. And that is that great man theory is incorrect. And most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, people are riding the trends, pretending to be controlling or directing them. Kind of like we're talking about with the Tea Party, kind of like we're talking about with the yellow vests. People have a tendency to leap in front of the parade and pretend that they're the band leader. But the larger socioeconomic and historical trends are simply playing out. There's a long cycle of the movement of peoples, followed by war, which is followed by the establishment of homogeneous societies. And so, the idea that you're going to, the idea that you're going to bring an end to that historical cycle, whether it's with a 1,000-year Reich, whether it's with a workers' paradise, whether it is with a new world order or the end of history, whatever you call it, you're almost certainly going to be wrong. And furthermore, if you're trying to do it, then we know, at least from the Christian perspective, who you serve and what you serve, and that it is not good. And so, when you look at, let's see, let me take some questions here. Actually, that's a good example. Leaping in front like 2VS with Comicsgate. That's exactly what Ethan Van Sciver did. Ethan Van Sciver was a critic of Comicsgate when it got started. And then when he saw that it might be advantageous to him, he jumped in and declared himself the leader of it. And so, which, by the way, was directly contrary to my recommendation to him. He talked to me about it, and I said, no, you absolutely shouldn't become the leader of it. If you become the leader of it, you'll destroy it. Not intentionally, but one way or another, leaping out and becoming the leader of some sort of amorphous, trend-based movement like that is always a mistake. Can fake leaders entirely destroy movements or only postpone progress? I think that they can entirely destroy them. They can, if you look at the Tea Party was destroyed by the fake leaders who leaped to the front of the parade. And some of them were fake, some of them were legitimate. And then as soon as they got into Congress, they all got bought off, or at least most of them did. The new Vanity Fair article, Let Me Make You Famous, How Hollywood Invented Ben Shapiro. I hadn't even heard about that, but it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. Is Fukuyama still worth reading? Yes, I think so. I've been reading, actually, I'm about, 60, 70 pages into his new book on identity politics. They're pretty, it's not worth reading I think he's trying to jump on a bandwagon there. But his book, his 2-volume set on, and I've got it in fact right back there, his 2-volume set on the political order is really good. The End of History is also worth reading simply to understand the intellectual justification for globalism. It's wrong. Fukuyama has basically been running around for the last 15 years trying to retroactively explain away how wrong he was. But it's still interesting and I think still worth reading if you'd like to understand how people are reacting to the trends. New camera looks really nice. Thanks very much. We're trying to up our game here a little bit. Let's see. Do you think Hitler was a gamma pushed into that position? I don't know. I mean, Hitler was a very strange guy in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I mean, certainly he sociosexually he appeared to have some strong gamma behaviors. But you're also talking about somebody who was a courageous winner of, I don't know if it was the Iron Cross, maybe it was, but I mean, he legitimately won a military award for his courage. That's not very gamma-like. So, people can be complicated. They just because we have these patterns of behavior does not mean that they apply perfectly in all situations, especially when you're dealing with a historical persona as unique as Hitler, Stalin, George Washington. I mean, these are extraordinary individuals. For better or for worse, for good or for evil, they are exceptional. And so you shouldn't expect exceptional people to fall into standard behavioral patterns. Thoughts on Tad Williams' work? Not a fan. I've tried it a couple times. I pretty much bounced off it. There must be some way to shape history, not just a deterministic cycle. Well, I mean, certainly you can shape history. All actions do shape history. They're trying to shape history with some of those powerful technological tools that have ever existed in human history. If they can't do it with that, it can't be done. And so if you look at the fact that we naturally behave in certain manners, we naturally behave in certain patterns, and we respond to certain stimuli in predictable ways, it's really difficult to imagine being able to completely sever those cycles. Thoughts on Evola? I'm not a big fan of Evola. I read a bit of his stuff. I wasn't very interested. I have read Hitler's Table Talk. It was the Iron Cross. Okay. Is Mishima worth reading? Yes, I very much enjoy reading Mishima. Will French citizens start killing police government? I have no idea. Happy that the Vikings offensive coordinator has been fired? Absolutely. I thought he was a disaster. I've read the Nazi Party was funded by some American corporations. I'm sure that it was funded in part, as were the Bolsheviks. I think you'd be surprised at some of the organizations that get funded by American corporations these days. Corporations are literally soulless. Have you seen the alleged 41 demands from the Yellow Vest movement? No, I haven't read those. I was busy all day today. I read Eco's History of Beauty after seeing it on your shelf. Are there other art-related books that you would recommend? Not off the top of my head, no. Let's see here. Thanks for asking about the dog. Kind of up and down today. He ate really well, and the doctors are really happy with that. But then this evening he was kind of limping a bit, or limping quite a bit. Hopefully that's just because he's got the IV thing in there. This is kind of these next 3-4 days are kind of the crucial point as far as we understand. Everybody's pulling for him. Everybody's fighting for him. And hopefully he'll pull through. But, you do everything you can. You pray and you hope for the best. What is your favorite Umberto Eco book? Foucault's Pendulum. I really love Name of the Rose. I really, really love Name of the Rose. But Foucault's Pendulum is the one that I tend to go back to again and again. It's the one that I think probably most fully captures my imagination. When the dog gets better, will you have a Darkstream? Certainly. Absolutely. He's actually been on it before. I picked him up very briefly. He's pretty big, so but some of you may recall seeing him some time ago. Let's see. What do you think of Jack Vance's work? I tend to admire Jack Vance's work more than I like it. It's very inventive, very influential, more intriguing than compelling. I think possibly the downside of Vance is mostly in his characters. His characters are not particularly sympathetic. They don't really draw you in. But the world is fascinating. The magic systems are fascinating. The wild ideas are enchanting. And then I guess also he's not that big on plot. So, he's definitely, I would consider him to be a really good writer, a uniquely talented writer, but not a great one. Is it worthwhile to do a deeper analysis on divorce statistics? Well, it's been done. I mean, I don't really see much need to do that. It's already done. The information is out there. The relevant information is out there. Do gammas have a tendency to define partial victories of their organization as total defeats? More to the contrary, they have a tendency to define anything that's associated with them as always being victorious, and anything that they don't like as always being a defeat. So, that's one of the ways you can always identify a gamma, is the way that they constantly posture as if they're winning, even when they're quite clearly getting their butt kicked. So, is it true that most of Hitler's henchmen were Jewish? I don't believe so. I've heard some of the more, let's say, exotic speculation out there, but that doesn't sound right to me. You need to keep in mind, there is absolutely no shortage of evil in the world. And trying to always drag it back to one particular group of people or race of people, however poorly behaved they may be known to act in certain historical situations, is not relevant. I mean, you should read The Outlaws of the Marsh, the Chinese classic. It's almost unbelievable to a Western mind. Chinese civilization is one of the greatest civilizations on the planet, but it is utterly alien to the Western mind. And I was reading it, and one of my theories about the centuries of conflict between Europeans and Jews is that it's really more of a artifact of high trust people having a group of high performance, low trust people in their midst. And so I think that what we're seeing with the conflict in the Ivy League and the conflict in Hollywood and what appears to be the rising conflict on the global scale is, I don't think that the Jews have any idea what they're in for when it comes to competing with the Chinese, when it comes to competing with the Indians and so forth, when it comes to competing with other high performance, low trust groups. I could be wrong. It's just it's not really I wouldn't call it a theory or anything. It's just more of a casual historical observation. But like I told Louise Mensch in our debate, it's one thing to cry Holocaust and get the sympathy of naive, trusting European people who will genuinely feel bad about this terrible thing that happened to you, your people 70 years ago. But try crying Holocaust to the Chinese, who offed nearly 10 times that many of their own people. It's not going to work, So I mean, the world is always more complicated than people think. One of the things I think is interesting is if you look at what people predicted, how people thought events were going to play out. I mean, we're talking the smartest people, the best analysts, the most intelligent observers of current events. And you look at their predictions for how things are going to play out. They are almost invariably so wrong. So whatever we think is going to happen, whatever we anticipate is going to happen, whatever linear trend we draw is almost certainly going to be totally incorrect. I mean, who would have thought that the outcome of World War II and the United States acquiring a monopoly on atomic weapons and having the only untouched industrial infrastructure in the world, who would have thought that would lead to a very powerful Jewish state with global influence? Nobody would have anticipated that, except for maybe a few of the folks who wanted to work towards that. But I mean, I would have bet on the Soviets before that. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to collapse the way it did. Nobody is expecting the United States to break apart. And yet we can predict pretty confidently that it's going to happen within the next 15 years or so. So, do you enjoy hunting or fishing at all, Vox? No. No, I don't. Let's see. Did Sun Tzu really exist, or is the art of war more of a collection of many strategies written over the centuries? I think it's much more likely that he existed. I've read The Art of War several times, and it does not read like something that was compiled from lots of different authors. What do you think of the idea that China's rise will be cut short by their aging population? I think that's total nonsense. Absolute and utter nonsense. I mean, Japan has more Japanese, far more Japanese, has more young Japanese than they did when they started World War II. So the idea that, they're dying, it's ridiculous. Birth rates, as Russia has proven, can turn around in a very short period of time. What do you think will happen to the States after the collapse? Well, I think that it's going to probably break into somewhere between 3 and 25 different nations. Look at what happened to every other empire that broke up. The Austro-Hungarian, the Roman. The U.S. is an empire, just like any other. Probably more like the Athenian Empire than most, but we'll see. I don't have any. I've read one version of the Outlaws of the Marsh. I mean, how many do you think I've read? And I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not equipped to have an opinion there. For a Christian, what do you think the best practice is to combat despair in this age? Well, I think that it is to pray, to read the Bible, and to read good philosophy. I mean, it's easy to despair. It's easy to be upset. I mean, I'm very upset about the fact that our dog is fighting for his life. But I'm also philosophical about the fact that we're doing literally everything we can. And despair doesn't help anything. It's not just useless, it's worse than useless. And so make the most of whatever time you have. Do what you can You know, we have what, 70, 80 years? In the long term, if you just look at the history of man alone, that's a tiny fraction of all of human history. And so I think that you need to focus on truth, beauty, hope, and joy wherever you can find it. I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about hedonism. I'm not talking about pleasure seeking. I'm not talking about drowning your feelings. I'm talking about embracing your feelings, embracing the reality of not running from them. Not running from your fear or not running from your grief, but looking for those silver linings. And there are always silver linings, even in, if you talk to people or you read the accounts of people who have been through unimaginable horrors, it's fascinating to see how they can talk about really appreciating the sunset, and so always seeking to look for look for the joy, always seeking to look for the hope. It can be painful, I know. Sometimes it's easier to just predict doom, expect doom, and if it doesn't turn out to be that bad, then I'm surprised. But that's really more of a pride thing. It's both a pride thing and a cowardly thing. You're afraid of disappointment. But I've been disappointed so many times about so many things that I've learned not to be afraid of it anymore. Don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of disappointment. Just learn to accept them philosophically when they come and try to learn whatever you can from it. So, this past week, Scott Adams seems to have realized America is screwed big time because of immigration. Well, gee, it took him long enough. If Jesus returned in the 20th century, how would you decide for yourself it was him? Well, it describes pretty clearly how he's going to return, so I don't think there's going to be any mistaking it. If you have any doubt at all, if you're not sure, is this Jesus Christ or not? It's not Jesus Christ. What is a good philosophy? I consider both Christian philosophy and Stoic philosophy to be good. I like Aurelius. I kind of like Augustine. I like Epictetus. I really like Marcus Aurelius. Do you have any new t-shirts coming out soon for Christmas? No, just what we've got that's out. We really need to do some more of that, but I've been busy and haven't gotten around to it. So, what's your favorite book of the New Testament? I think probably Ephesians. What do you think of Seneca? I'm a fan of Seneca as well. I like Seneca's approach. I appreciated his defiance to the end. Christina says, you don't seem to lament the death of America. Well, how long can you lament it? I predicted it back in 2004. I publicly. Now, I expected it long before that. And everybody told me that I was crazy. But, I could see I could see the historical patterns. I could see how things were changing as a result of the changing demographics. And it's not that hard to see, what the result of the largest movement of peoples in human history is going to be. Are you going to put Throne of Bones on Audible? Absolutely. We were hoping to get it done in time for Christmas. It's about like 95% done, but it's really long. We're talking like 40 hours. So, don't worry. We'll definitely do a Darkstream when Throne of Bones is out in audio. Are you going on Millennial? No, I don't do media or new media or podcasts really anymore. The only people that I talk to are, people that we already work with in some way. Let's see. Read Jordanetics over the weekend. Thank you for writing it. I can't believe I used to think Peterson was an all right guy. Now that I see he is an antichrist. Well, antichrist with a small a, holomorphic bear. He's an antichrist. He's not the antichrist. And so if you look at, there's somebody mentioned that there was I can't remember, they're called like 3 something or others. They did a really pathetic attempt to criticize Jordanetics, apparently without reading it. But it's just, Peterson's fans are really reacting in a very fearful and desperate manner to Jordanetics. They have to lie about it because everything in there is documented. Everything in there is substantiated. When I say Jordan Peterson is mentally ill, I then quote Jordan Peterson talking about how he is on 2 medications that he's been prescribed for a mental illness. There's nothing to discuss. Either you're ill or you're not. If you're ill, is it a physical illness or is it a mental illness? Well, it's a mental illness. Okay, there's nothing to discuss here. In the same way, when I say he is a habitual liar, I then quote Jordan Peterson talking about how he lies all the time. How since he was young, he has been, dishonest, and he gives his various reasons why he's dishonest. So, this is not ad hominem. I'm not criticizing his philosophy on the basis of it being advocated and taught by a mentally ill liar. I directly address what his philosophy says and why I believe it to be wrong and evil and misguided and unhelpful. And then I point out the fact that maybe it is those things because its author is dishonest, is an intellectual charlatan, misrepresents citations, misrepresents data, knowingly lies about historical events. All of these things, is ignorant about matters on which he opines. One thing that escaped a lot of people, for example, was the whole Kavanaugh thing. Everybody said, the Kavanaugh is totally betrayed his stance. But what I thought was the most interesting thing is that Peterson jumped in with his thought experiment, and he thought that Kavanaugh had been appointed to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's how little he knew about it. He didn't even know what position Kavanaugh was appointed to. He didn't even know what the actual stakes were. How pompous and arrogant and careless and sloppy and stupid do you have to be to weigh in publicly on something? That would be like me weighing in on the U.S. election and talking about how I think that Trump would make a better prime minister for America than Hillary Clinton. Anyone who did that would be laughed at. And yet nobody seemed to notice that Peterson thought that Kavanaugh was being nominated for Roberts' position, not the vacant position of Associate Justice. So, anyhow, uh, yeah, it is kind of funny how many. It's always mildly alarming. Somebody commented how many bears are here. It's like, I mean, I'm happy to have them, but every now and then I'm just looking, going, my goodness, there's a lot of bears here. So, anyhow, good for you guys. I realize that you're probably here because Owen's on tour. And I have to say that I really cracked up at those clips that Owen posted. I don't know if they're actually from this tour or not, but they're really good. And again, I answer, I am going to get together and talk with Owen soon, but he's on tour. We'll do it when he gets back at his convenience. So, what do you think of Andrew Klavan? Andrew Klavan is friends with someone that I know pretty well and that I respect. And I think that he is a genuinely good man, but I think that he is too naive and trusting, and he's probably too steeped in his industry to really be able to see with clarity some of the frauds that he's surrounded by. You know, I've never heard anything bad about Klavan. I've only heard positive things about how he's a good guy and all that sort of thing. You know, but he does certainly seem to be surrounded by a lot of people that are not people that I would have any confidence in. But you know, you can't. You know, I don't think it's right to pronounce people guilty by association. Certainly, people enjoy finding me guilty of association. I mean, I'm absolutely guilty of associating with Milo. Milo and I were associating in the red light district of Paris until the early hours. You know, so you know, I think it's fair to be wary of people based on their associations. I think it's reasonable to, you know, look a little bit more carefully at them because of their associations. But at the end of the day, every man has to be judged by his own words and deeds. You know, how about Michael Knowles? I don't know who Michael Knowles is. You mentioned in another Darkstream that China is going to be unveiling its own version of the Monroe Doctrine. What do you think that's going to look like? I think they're going to declare the South China Sea and the South Pacific in general off limits to the West. That should be happening in the relatively near future, probably within the next 5 to 7 years, I would guess. You know, once these missiles, you know, these hypersonic missiles render the surface navies irrelevant, it's going to be very, very difficult for the West and the U.S. in particular to project its military power on a global basis. Thoughts on Socrates? He's dishonest. If you read The Irrational Atheist, you can see that I catch him out in a couple Richard Dawkins, you know, a couple bait and switches worthy of Richard Dawkins. I'm not a big fan. Do you think Australia will do relatively well? They at least have mostly high IQ Asian immigrants. That's a contradiction in terms right there. Australia is going to be taken over by those high IQ Asian immigrants. It's going to become a Chinese satrapy, if not colony. How was Socrates lying? He wasn't lying per se. Well, he was basically being logically dishonest. He was claiming something that had not been He just did a bait and switch. If you look up, you can look it up on my blog, or it's also in The Irrational Atheist. Do you think he deserved the hemlock drink? No, I don't think so. Favorite classical composers? Actually, today we listened to Handel's Messiah in its entirety, which is always great. I like Haydn. I like Handel. I like Mozart, of course. I like Dvorak, Wagner, and Vivaldi. Let's see. Yeah, but see here, Knowles did a good job at Politicon, mocking and debating the left. When are you guys going to learn? Mocking and debating the left is how the fake conservatives always become popular. You know, I'm not saying that he is a fake conservative. I'm just saying that stop being impressed by people who tell you how bad the left is. Left versus right is largely irrelevant now. Globalist versus nationalist, good versus evil, those are the things that matter now. What non-classical music do you like? Well, David Sylvian, Disturbed, Baby Metal, Bandmade. So, let's see. Yeah, Matvey Danilovich says, I've seen Shapiro destroy the left so many times. How are they still around? With one devastating tweet, no less. Let's see. Being taken over by the Chinese is better than being overtaken by Somalis or Afghans. Yeah, I don't know. I would read Outlaws of the Marsh. So, all right. Well, that's all I've got time for tonight. But we're gonna watch the Yellow Vest protests proceed with interest. It'll be very interesting to see if they give in. By the way, I should mention before I go, Jordanetics is now available in paperback on Amazon. You can get it at Amazon for $19.99. If you go to Castalia Books Direct, you can get it for $14.99. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly encourage you to do so, because the issues that are dealt with there are issues that are going to be dealt with long after Jordan Peterson's 15 minutes of fame are over. So have a good evening. I look forward to seeing you the next time, and we will see you at the next Darkstream.